Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and today we're going to be doing a special installment by faculty and student request. We're going to be talking about how to refine the Declaration of Research Problem assignment that every student in the Doctorate in Educational Leadership, the EdD program, does. Now, this is something where the content is dictated mostly by what students such as yourselves might be interested in. So if you are working on this assignment already, if you have a draft and you'd like to get anonymous feedback during this session, just go ahead and send me an email at the address I just typed in the chat, and I'm happy to include that. We do have a student draft that was submitted in advance that we'll kick off with. But again, if you are working on this assignment and you want some feedback, this is the place. We have created this opportunity just for exactly that. So a little bit of a background. There are multiple assignments that feed into preparing of formulating your ideas for your eventual dissertation. But this is one where it fulfills a specific milestone where we're tracking, okay, have they done this thing? And it's not just an assignment that is intended to steer you. This is one of the areas where you say, here's what I plan to do very concretely. And we have this list where I went and pulled faculty for what the most common issues they saw with this assignment were. And we'll look at the actual assignment in a moment, but just take a look and see if we see any themes here. So lack of clear articulation of a clear problem. Who has it? What is the significance? A lack of appropriate supporting evidence, appropriate mostly meaning citations to scholarly peer-reviewed literature. Overarching consequences, which I would say I would translate perhaps as exaggerated consequences, or it seems more extreme than the information you provided, like you're leaping to the worst possible outcome, perhaps. Unclear responsibility. So this is, I think, tying in with a specific question in the form about how this relates to leaders or leadership, and the unclear connection to concentration. So the EdD program at ACU, unlike some other universities, has the set of scholarly concentrations that you can choose, and your dissertation should tie into that. Now, we'll talk about that more as we go further, but because we have some of the materials prepared here, let's go ahead and let's take a look at this particular assignment. Because one of the questions I get from students is, hold on, wait, I have to do this. Where do I find it? So if you are enrolled in the program, before too long, you'll be enrolled in our online EdD dissertation course, DIS 777. Now, you can navigate through a number of different ways, including going through the different modules to find this. In our case, we're going to just do a word search here and search for declaration, and we find that one of the first things in this beginnings area is the Declaration of Research Problem, because this is where you're just starting to concretize your ideas and say, hey, I'm going down that journey. I've thought about it. This is what I want to do. And not just a general, here are things that I'm interested in, as you will do in, say, Leadership 701, but taking a more concrete step forward there. And so we see that this assignment here, we have a form that needs to be submitted, and it's normally due on the last day of the term. Or if you get feedback, which is very common, if you get feedback and a request to revise, so sometimes you get feedback that's more advisory, and sometimes you get feedback that says, hey, please make some changes. We're concerned about X. In that case, what students usually will do is they'll look at the feedback, they'll perhaps start answering it, and then they'll make an appointment with the Writing Center during week 0, so that when it comes to that deadline on 5 p.m. on the first day of week 1, and that it is clear that you've given some time to think about the feedback you received, that you've gotten an outside opinion to make sure that you're articulating things clearly, and some assistance checking to see if you're meeting the rubric, and then you go ahead and submit it. Now, the fact that the declarations are normally only reviewed at the end of the term does mean that sometimes there is a little bit of a lag, and that's fine. What I think is important to take from this is that you'll probably be very busy during that 7-week period with other things. But when you do get that feedback, you want to make sure you've marked out time in your schedule already to respond to it, because an approved declaration of research problem lets you know this is a direction you can keep going in. If you're revising it for more than just that time between terms, that can make it hard for you to shape the rest of the things when you're not sure, is this a path I'm committing to? So is it the worst thing in the world if you get asked to revise? No, it happens all the time. I would say in my experience, a majority of students are asked to make some significant changes, some of which do involve resubmitting and some of which don't. In my own dissertation, I had some plans for what I wanted to do, and the committee said, we think that the language requirements might make it hard to do it on this timeline. Would you consider doing this thing instead? And I was proposing to learn a language and start asking questions right away. And they pointed out, hey, you can only study this language in the country that you're going to. You're probably not going to be very fluent in the first month. Maybe if you do it in this other time period, it'll be more reasonable. And thought about that. It's like, that actually does seem very good advice. And so I revised per their feedback, resubmitted, and all was good. All right, let's take a look at this form here. So if you click on this link, you'll see this blank form, the Declaration of Research Problem, and it has a set of 5 questions, and you're only supposed to give 1 to 3 sentences each. So this means that if you can answer it very concisely and with appropriate detail and support, that's all you need. If you have paragraphs and paragraphs, it might be helpful to have a conversation with someone, which could include the writing center, could include a colleague, could include a professor. But if you have paragraphs, then it was probably helpful to have a talk with someone about what the core thing is, what the most important is, because this isn't intended to state everything that will go into the eventual problem statement section. No, this is letting us know that you've got a specific idea, that it is backed up by you're having done some research, and that it is important enough to merit study and connected to what you're doing, to the purpose, the mission, as it were, of getting a doctorate in education leadership. All right, let's take a look at a student-submitted example here. And by the way, if you do have one that you'd like to get feedback on yourself, just send me an email and a message so I know to check my email afterwards. So we have this draft here, and I've taken out the student's information, but I can tell you that they do, based on their response, have the particular concentration, learning with emerging technologies. So you also get the question, should this be an APA style? Well, it's not going to hurt you. So I would recommend writing it in APA style, because that makes it easy to transfer any text that might end up in your document. One moment. Okay, you should now see my screen in Microsoft Word. Please let me know if that's not the case. And let's take a look at this first one. So in 1 to 3 sentences, you're being asked to respond to each of the following prompts with 1 to 3 sentences, draw directly from your exploration of research problem paper, informed by instructor feedback. So this is saying, we're not expecting you to recreate the wheel here, or the world, but you should look at the exploration of research problem paper, and if there's any feedback saying that this is vague or it's unclear what the problem is, pay close attention to that. Now, if we look at this, we see we're being asked to describe the problem and the specific tensions or conflicting issues creating the problem. Okay. Teacher burnout is endemic. Well, that doesn't sound good. Teachers are expected to respond to parent, student, and administrator communications after business hours and have little time to do grading. Also doesn't sound good. At the same time, they're expected to prepare individual learning plans that require unreasonable amounts of work. That also doesn't sound good. Now, if you're looking at this, there may be something that's leaping out to you as you have migrated through your program and heard repeatedly that in APA style, you want to use consistent terminology to refer to the same thing. So if this prompt is asking you to describe the problem, we want to make sure that your sentences are using the word problem so we know that you are identifying that thing that you're asked to do in the prompt. So now teacher burnout, that could be the problem they're focusing on. These expectations for communication and how that conflicts with grading, either those could be the problem or both. And the ILPs could also be the problem. So we have a number of things competing for this, some of which could be background information, some of which could be the central problem. So let's look at how we might edit that based on any of those choices. So I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to create a couple copies of that text. And let's talk about how we would tweak that if the problem was the teacher burnout itself, if that's where the focus is. And keep in mind this wording in your context or your setting. And for that, we want to be as specific as we can. That could be in the United States, in a state, in a district, delineating by geography or something that overlays on geography. We could be focusing on school level, like primary school, secondary school, kindergarten, university. Or we could be focusing on a particular thing, like, say, science teachers, or let's say freshman composition. So depending on what we're doing there, if our focus is on teacher burnout, the best way to tell the reader that is to have the word the problem in this sentence. Now, if you just say teacher burnout, that doesn't give us a sense of scale. And even if you were to go ahead and say endemic teacher burnout, well, that tells us that it's happening all the time or very regularly, but it doesn't give us a sense of the prevalence, how many people have it. So if you're talking about your context, this is an opportunity to be more specific. The problem in my context is a high endemic level of teacher burnout. Now, there's more detail you could potentially add, but if we look at this, we see, okay, we're saying, all right, high endemic level. So it's high and it's happening all the time. Now, you could tell us more about the context, and that can go at the end of the sentence or it can go here. And now if you say, the problem in my Texas public school district or Texas urban public school district context, now we have an idea of where this problem is taking place and under what conditions. Now, if you're talking about the district, that's different if you're talking about just a school. So be as specific as you can, because that gives us an idea of what exactly you're saying the problem is. Now, what would you do if the problem was, that the problem the student wanted to focus on was this communication problem and how it competes with grading? And so maybe teacher burnout is relevant to mention, but if the focus is on this conflict in time and how it prevents doing things, then we don't actually need to mention that. So assuming that this sentence here is delineating the problem, let's see how we would make that more clear. The problem in my context is that teachers, and you can to just show you how you would put some of this information about the context in a different place, you could put it here. The problem in my context is that teachers at a rural public high school in Louisiana are expected to respond to parent, student, and administrator communications after business hours and have little time to do grading. Now that kind of conveys things, but it doesn't actually say that this little time to do grading is the result of this. So we can make that even more specific and add wording like, and as a result, have little time to do grading. Now, if this is giving supporting evidence that there are lots of things preying on their time, great, mention it. But I would say let's focus on what the key problem is. So is the problem that they have too many demands on their time here, preventing grading? Does this? So you might end up with a multi-part topics sentence here. So that might look something like this. Right, the problem in my context is that teachers at a rural public school in Louisiana are so overburdened by relatively new writing and communication requirements that they have little time to do grading. And so if we make this change here, this becomes, okay, this is a statement of the problem in the context. Here's an example of some of the things that create this problem. But the focus has shifted to the problem being, hey, there are these things that add up to not a lot of time to do grading. Now, let's look at how things would be if they were focused on here. Now, it does vary by the district, but generally when you're talking individual learning plans, or the term that I prefer, individualized learning plans, ILPs, usually you're talking about some sort of special education situation, students of differing abilities, perhaps. And so if that is the focus, then we're missing some key information about which teachers we're talking about here. So let's look at how that might be customized. So let's say, for the sake of our example here, that we're talking about the same school setting as the previous one. Okay, teachers at a rural public high school in Louisiana. And then focus on where the problem is. They're expected to prepare individual learning plans that require unreasonable amounts of work. And where is this going? Causing chronic burnout and high turnover. Now, just saying that these happen doesn't give us a sense that that's bad so much. So let's make that more specific. The problem in my context is that teachers causing chronic burnout and high turnover, and then we could go different ways. You could go, and I'm just going to write this out to show some of the variety. Depending on your focus, you might have increases staffing costs. It could be decreases student performance, or it could be whichever one you are choosing. or something else that I haven't thought of here will take you in a dramatically different direction. So this is one of the reasons why often feedback on this first question is asking students to be more specific about what exactly the problem is. And if we go back to our slides earlier, clear problem, who has it, what is the significance? Yeah. If it's a financial problem because the district needs to pay more, that's very different than if it's a classroom problem where the teachers need to change or manage somehow. All right, let's go back and look at the next answer here. So what do teachers currently know about the problem, and what is a recommendation for further exploration? Support your response with one current citation. Well, the answer we have here is this problem has been documented in multiple studies. An area for future research is boundary setting meetings with parents. Okay, the problem with the first sentence is that it gives what's called an unsupported assertion. So it's saying this problem has been documented in multiple studies, but it's not giving us any evidence for that. There are no parenthetical citations. Now, if you had something here, you could add something like E period, G period, and have and that gives us some idea. We see two studies there. Okay, but that's not quite taking us all the place we want yet. So an area for future research is boundary setting meetings with parents. Well, it doesn't tell us who was recommending that. And we don't have that clear identification. And here, in fact, let's look at this. It says researchers currently know. So while in multiple studies kind of tells us that, we can be even more explicit by having multiple researchers or research teams, depending on that. Now, if you say multiple researchers and you have lots of researchers on one study, that's not as convincing as you have the same number of authors writing separate studies. So do pay attention to what's being now, if we are looking at this, the fact that we have 3 citations, 2014, 2019, 2023, that's not bad. But what would you think if the citations were instead like this, with 2009, 2013, 2014? Well, there we don't have an example of recent research that is backing this up. And recent research, a good rule of thumb is last 5 years, most people agree is fairly recent research. With teachers in schools, you know that in the last 5 years, we had the COVID pandemic hit. It might be helpful to go more recent than that if we're talking about things like teacher burnout. So that doesn't mean they all have to be, but if you have one thing that's current and then a few going back, showing that this has been observed over time, that is more helpful than if they're all from the same year or if they're all older. All right, now an area for future research. Now, that doesn't tell us who is doing that, so you might instead have something like this. Now, that is telling us, oh, that author suggested that this be an area of study. Now, if that happens to be an area that you're doing, awesome. You now have a scholar who is supporting what you're doing. And great. That is really all we need, because remember that this is asking for 1 to 3 sentences. So if you say everything you need in 2 sentences, that's not a problem. All right. Now let's take a look back and see if you can guess what I might identify as an area for improvement for this next one. Okay, so we have on this overarching consequences. Well, let's take a look at what we have. Students will fail out of school and enter the school to prison pipeline. Well, that does sound bad. It also sounds rather severe. I don't know how many students are facing this risk, but it's probably not all of them. And hopefully, I hope, not a majority of them. Really hope it's not a majority of them. So my guess is that the student wanted to make clear that there were some significant repercussions which could contribute towards it's a dropping out. This is one of those things where it's such an extreme example that without anything else, it makes it sound like you're being alarmist. Now, let's contrast this with, let's say, and again, for the purposes of our example, we're going to go with the this one here. And let's just say that we made this special education teachers. All right. If special education teachers are too overworked by non-teaching responsibilities, now this is the kind of thing where we could do a quick library search and very soon find many studies backing this up. So I would, if possible for your topic, I would recommend that you go ahead and do a search. In fact, let's go ahead and do one right now. So we're going to head over to the web browser and we're going to do a search, and we're going to go to Google Scholar, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a quick scholarly search engine that focuses on peer-reviewed research. You can link it into your ACU library access. You can download articles from databases that require password access and whatnot. We're going to look at lifetime earning, students with disabilities. And if we were looking through here, we'd quickly find that there's some recommendations for what has to happen for to set conditions up for success here. So, for example, education lifetime earnings in the United States, we could read that. I happen to be already familiar with that paper there. So if we were going to go ahead and cite this, this would be Tamburini et al. 2015. Okay. And so if you have wording like this is saying, okay, this is not just my saying it, someone else has said this is connected. All right, we'll look more briefly at numbers 4 and 5. How does this problem connect to leaders or leadership? Leaders need to address this problem or students will end up in jail. I think we're missing a couple steps to get there. So when we're looking at connects to leaders or leadership, we should focus on what might leaders do to address the situation. Is it within their power? So compare this to, let's say, to address this problem, but that would be giving a solution. And we don't want to do that yet. There's a point for this. We're not at that point yet because you have to do research. If you could just say, oh, here's the solution and be sure of that, then it wouldn't be a dissertation-worthy topic. We need something that will take some time and attention to evaluate. So now something you might notice here is that this is saying, okay, this thing is a problem for these people because reasons. We're also introducing this term here so we don't need to spell out trained and experienced teachers all the time. We can just say veteran teachers. Now you can refer to, say, industry guidelines. And so whatever it is, supporting citation. And if you're still working out things and you need to go ahead and do some research, leave yourself a placeholder note like that, because that tells you, okay, I should go back and do my research after I've articulated these thoughts and make sure I'm not just making this up. I'm not making an unsupported assertion. And then you can go ahead and do that before you turn it in. All right, now this next one, how might this problem connect to program concentration? The student has listed, I'm not sure how this connects to learning with emerging technologies. Now, it might be that they want to change the concentration because they have a research interest that really fits in another area. And that's not the end of the world if you want to change your concentration. I will say that I changed the concentration for my dissertation. Here at ACU, you could be positive leadership, you could be higher ed, conflict management, learning with emerging technologies. When I was doing my dissertation, partway through, they changed the offerings that were possible. And so there's the option to graduate with the old concentrations or with the new. And it happened that I noticed that the job requirements for new positions were using the names of the concentrations and the new ones, like, oh, I think I should probably change that. So if you are looking at your declaration of research problem text and thinking, gosh, it really sounds like I'm more interested in doing this conflict management thing. Well, this is a good time to think about how you would go in that direction. And if need be, have a talk with the program director or one of the faculty. Now, that said, it might be something where that's just the one point where you don't have clear thoughts yet. And there it's really helpful to talk things through with a colleague or a faculty person, because you might find that your interest is actually still on your initial concentration, but that there's something about how you might adapt this to focus on that. So let's say we were working at this communication part. So there's that question of how are those communications coming in? So let's say that we're taking this one here and we're going to put in some extra detail to make it more clear how you could align. The problem in my context is that teachers at a rural public high school in Louisiana are expected to respond to parent, student, and administrator text messages, emails, and phone calls after business hours. Now we're starting to get a tech tie-in because they're getting contacted through multiple channels. Hopefully they're not getting paper mail. That would be a very slow turnaround for many things. But if it's something like this, where it's not so much, the teachers at meeting with parents at the PTA conferences, but it's more of, hey, there's a parent sending messages asking about their kids' homework, and all 12 parents in that class are all sending messages. Then you might be looking at something where the problem is particularly technology related, and the solution may be technology related. And I will say that's not an example I've just made up. That is an example of research that one of my other students has worked on, where their dissertation was basically looking at using a group messenger application for student questions and for parent questions, so that if you're responding to one question, that everyone could see it easily. And that the spoilers, that the way it worked was that their study found that this actually greatly decreased the teacher stress and the amount of time they had to spend responding to things. And that the only problem was that the parents had set up their own group message, and so they had a lot of chatter that some of the parents didn't like, because there were so many people sharing dog pictures and stuff like that. Anyway, we have a opportunity here for, if this was your paper, to think about what you want to do. And that's probably going to involve seeing how your concentration intersects with how you're defining, how you're delineating the problem. Now, I did get a message saying that students had submitted a draft. So let me go ahead and grab that and anonymize it. This is a good time to go grab a glass of water or something like that. And so let me go ahead and do that now. And once I'm done with that, we will be ready to hit off. All right. Thank you again for the student who submitted that. Let's go ahead and take a look at that new sample here. All right. So we have here, describe the problem in your context or setting. The problem in my context is that few Black women nonprofit leaders serve as organizational leaders in Connecticut's nonprofit ecosystem. When and where Black women leaders exist, they are known to be leaders of high-impact organizations. Still, there is not enough data about how these women leaders use traits of positive leadership to improve organizational culture and advance organizational impact. Okay, so looking at this, I would guess that a faculty person reading this would have some questions about what exactly you want to focus on. Now, my guess, having looked at the rest of the text really quickly, my guess is that it is a issue not so much with the numbers, but with the larger, how this fits in as an example of a larger problem with leadership diversity. And I say that because there is this sentence here in the next section that is talking about the documentation of this phenomenon, the lack of diversity among nonprofit leadership. So we'll come back to that in a moment, because we want to see how this is aligning. And by the way, that's always a good test to do, to look through and make sure that these different sections are agreeing with each other on what you're focusing on, because it's very natural for your ideas to evolve as you do more research, as you do more reading. And whoops, I'm sorry, I have the wrong example on shared. you should now see the one I was referring to and reading from. All right, so to recap again, this sentence here in the next thing is focusing on that lack of diversity among nonprofit leaders. So we want to check and see, is the general thrust supporting this specific thing, or is this kind of the lead-in to the larger problem? Now, if we look at this example here, it's focusing on racial and ethnic diversity. Now, this one here is saying that if this problem persists, organizational leaders of nonprofits serving these communities may not promote or recruit leaders that can serve well. And this, I think, is saying that there are, there's a strong association with a lack of diversity and not getting these benefits. And the concentration is positive leadership. Okay, with all those things in mind, we're going to roll back to number one. And by the way, if this is your thing, you can certainly message me privately if you want to make any clarifications here. Looking at this, my guess is that if we're just a little bit more specific about a couple things, it'll start to clarify. So I'm going to copy and paste an example here, and we're going to tweak this. So let's start with a checklist here. And this is one of those things where if you were in my office as one of my students brainstorming about this assignment, we would make up this checklist. So we have first, context, Connecticut nonprofits. Now, looking at this, within that context, we want to be more specific. So that's our subcontext, leadership. Now, leadership can be more than one type of thing. We could be talking about, say, executive and administrative leaders who are paid for that, or we could be talking about board members who in most US states are not allowed to be compensated for their board of directors service. So if we are talking about people who are not being paid, let's call those non-volunteer leadership at those Connecticut nonprofits. And then looking at this further, what else can we focus in on? So organizational leaders. So be perhaps helpful to define that. If you were doing the larger paper, you might say, oh, people with the title of executive director, managing director, or whatever you wanted to focus. Could be more than one. But it is a little bit different when you are looking at, the middle management, say, that you might get at a larger nonprofit versus the top level. And if we took this context and subcontext, how might we revise that? The problem is that most Connecticut, that Connecticut nonprofits in general have few Black women non-volunteer organizational leaders. Now, what does this change here? Okay, the problem is that Connecticut nonprofits in general have few Black women non-volunteer organizational leaders. That's making us look at things at more of a state level. Now, that could be what you want, or it could be something where you're like, well, it's happening in Connecticut, but I really want to focus in on the individual organization. And, those are different things. So it's entirely fair if you pick one over the other. These will lead in different directions. Again, if this is your paper, you're welcome to send me some information by private message. If you were going in the other direction, then I would expect that it would be something more along these lines. The problem is that let's actually make this. The general problem is that Connecticut nonprofits in general, that's a little bit redundant on the wording, but it gets the meaning across. The general problem is that Connecticut nonprofits in general have few Black women non-volunteer organizational leaders. The specific problem, and this is wording that you would have to use in later assignments. It's not a huge problem. It's not a problem to have it here. Just a lot of people haven't gotten to that specific thing unless they have a research site or some potential research sites in mind already. The specific problem is that and here we'd want to narrow it down to a sector or a particular nonprofit or something like that, is that, let's say, and then we need to set up what the problem is. Now, I'm just going to make up something to illustrate this point, but this would be how you might identify a specific issue within the larger problem. Now, if you're doing something like this, we have, okay, the general problem is that Connecticut nonprofits tend not to have many people meeting these characteristics. The specific problem is that, hey, this particular organization in Connecticut, or it could be a group of organizations, serves this group, but they don't have that. And the next step would be to say why that is bad or why that is not desirable. So we would add that. And keeping in mind, we have a couple sentences potentially to do that. Well, it turns out that there is some text here already that is aimed at that. So if we are looking at this and how we would dovetail these in, okay, which prevents them from gaining well-documented benefits of having leadership match the population being served. And then you'd want to have a supporting citation for that because you're making a claim about those benefits. And then you could take this next one and then you'd want to have another citation. Now, this next sentence hints at a direction that the student might want to be going. It says, still, there's not enough data about how these women leaders use their traits of positive leadership to improve organizational culture. Well, that's taking us in a different direction. So I'm not sure if that's something that will remain in this, because that's talking about a knowledge gap. What the information above seems to be talking about is a hiring gap or a practice gap. A practice gap is, hey, we know these things are useful. People aren't doing them. As opposed to here, this is saying, well, we don't really know how they get their magic. Why is it that they're more effective? And either is a perfectly worthy topic of study, but we want to make sure that you are going in the direction that you intend. If you were going in that direction, I think we have just enough time to type something in there. If you were going in that direction, you'd want to redefine the problems somewhere along these lines. The problem in my context, we'll leave that as placeholder text for now. The problem in my context is that although Black women leaders of nonprofits are known to be highly effective, it is not clear what their strategies and actions that make them so effective are, preventing replication of these strategies. So this is the direction that you would go more if you had something like this being your supporting evidence. Now, again, either those foci is perfectly fine. You just want to pick which one because you're supposed to be very clear about what you are proposing here. All right, so now looking at this next one, researchers say that there's a lack of diversity among nonprofit leaders. Most nonprofit executive leaders are white. So what we can do here, we can point this statement by taking out the non-essential text. And because the student has helpfully included a citation there. All right, so this is saying there's a lack of diversity. Oh, researcher wrote about it. Now you could, it's the similarly board leadership. So this is one of those things where we want to be clear about who we're talking about here. Or you could say boards of directors to be specific about that. And now we can take this out and say, okay, we have this, but then we have another sentence here. So we need to square these away. So this is saying, okay, we know that there's not a lot of diversity. If your focus is as above, talking about Black women, it might be helpful to point out that, and we'll just align that capital, and that Black women are severely underrepresented. Now, underrepresented can mean a number of things, which is why we want to add the context compared to the general population. And now, if you're giving a regional context, that might be important. I will tell you, I lived in Minnesota for many years. Much of the state, you will not find a shade of skin that is not white. Some parts of St. Paul, you will find that white people are severely outnumbered by, say, people of Hmong Asian descent, or in St. Paul, in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood, where Somali Americans and Ethiopian Americans significantly outnumber. So let's be clear about our context. So if we're talking here, nationwide in the United States, that's telling us, okay, in general, if we look at the country as a whole, here's what that looks like. There's a lack of diversity. So looking at this here, if we're focusing on Black women, we can look and see how this might fit in. Okay, almost half of nonprofit executive leaders are women. So let's point that. We'll use however. So we're contrasting. And then we'll link these two here and use some parallel wording here. This indicating that the underrepresentation, and here it uses executive leaders. So we've got that here. Perhaps we would change this here to align. And in fact, we might suggest doing that up here as well. All right. indicating that the underrepresented of Black women as leaders is not due solely to their gender. All right, we have a few minutes here, so let's take a look at this next section here. If this as problem persists, organizational leaders of nonprofits serve these communities may not promote or recruit leaders that can serve with the leadership style. So may not doesn't really give us a sense of likelihood. And this is something where, from the literature, I know that the recommendations in saying, hey, you should do this because you're likely to run into these consequences. So if you're working on this, I would look at it and say, how can I back this up? Because that'll help you shape the wording. If this problem persists, as researchers predict that, and here it's really focusing on the nonprofits rather than their leaders. If this problem persists, researchers predict that nonprofits that serve those communities will be less able and likely to, and now here's this, promote or recruit leaders. I'm not sure that's the big picture we're looking at here. Again, it'll depend on the focus above, but I think this is leading in the direction of less likely to serve their communities well. And then if you say that, now we've got the big picture. Now you can anchor this as, and this is part of it. If not addressed, nonprofits will be less likely to promote or recruit the leaders that can serve. And we'll use the same wording here again. And we're just going to change that to be here so it reads a little more directly, to create an internal sense of well-being among staff and impact in the community as a result of to the benefits of this leadership reflecting their community being served. Okay, we're almost out of time here, so we'll just look at this last one. What is known in the community is that where Black women exist as leaders, they use positive relationships, positive communication, employee strengths, development to make an impact. It is unknown how often and how apparent it is to them that they use a positive leadership style. That may be true. If this is the area of interest, I would say then it's focusing less on the underrepresentation, but more on a study of understanding and documenting the practice. How do these people do it? You know, what are their techniques? Now, again, I don't know what the exact direction you're going there is, but that would be a very different study from looking at, well, how can we get people to hire a more diverse board? Lastly, looking at number 5, how that focuses or how it connects to positive leadership. So here's a thought there. If one of the things that draws you as a student to positive leadership is the idea of serving a community better by using things that resonate with them and speak to them, and what you want to do is to find out how other people can do that better. If that's the case, then you'd be going in the direction of having this connecting to program concentration as, okay, there's a practice gap or there's a knowledge gap. I'd say probably more the knowledge gap. And that would be about, okay, we know they're using positive leadership, but how is it working, or why is it working, or what specifically are they doing? Now, if you're going more at the on the, serving better by hiring people that reflects that. There is certainly many ways you connect to the positive leadership part, one of which might be to say, okay, we want to educate people about the benefits of this and talk about how to train up and retain. And there are many ways you could go on that. You could look at organizations that had a policy of building up, of hiring people at an earlier level and preparing them to be executive leaders. Certainly a field with many opportunities. You could also look at how to educate boards, and say boards that did hire a group, how do they go about doing that? Many different ways of doing it. But if you go back to this first part and ask, is it the specific connection with the area? Is it with the set of nonprofits, or is it about that community that you want to serve? That'll help you steer between these different options. That was an excellent example. Thank you so much for submitting it. If this was your paper, I will go ahead and email you the track changes that you saw today so that you can look at that and make your own choices later. I won't get to it until after the next webinar because we're about to move into one of our live edit sessions. So let me just go ahead and we're going to wrap this up. And if you have any questions related to this webinar or something discussed, feel free to send us an email at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. You can schedule an appointment by going to my.acu.edu and under resources, academic resources, scroll down and hit more until you see the Online Writing Center. And then go ahead and you can find us online at blogs.acu.edu/online writing center. That's it for tonight. We'll be starting the live edit momentarily.